Good morning, students and families. My name is Heather Hegg. I teach 6th grade English Language Arts at Hubert Middle School. The lesson I'm teaching today focuses on identifying the central idea. So our objective for the lesson, there are 2 parts to it. The first part is that the students, you will figure out the central idea of an informational text and how it's made clear through details. So once you find the central idea, you're going to find those key details that support or prove that central idea. The second part of the lesson will write a summary of the text. Now your summary is going to be free from personal opinions and judgment. We'll talk about those a little later after we write the summary. So as I model this lesson, or as the lady on the video models the lesson, I want you to think about, so what is the central idea? And as you watch the video, there are some look-fors. The first look-for is central idea, the definition. So what is central idea? Then I want you to think about the title and the section headings. How do they help us figure out the central idea? I want you to know what the introduction is and how to read that to start figuring out the central idea. I want you to pay attention to the way the instructor highlights information in the text. And finally, she's going to present you with a question at the end that you should always write out the answer to, or at least talk about the answer before writing your summary. So let's begin. This is from News ELA, and I really like it. It's called a little lesson, and so they give you these little lessons to help clarify what you're going to do when you get into the text.
Hi everyone, I'm Alice from News ELA. I live and work out of Sacramento, California.
Oops.
Teacher here. Your teachers have asked me to tell you a little bit more about using annotations on News ELA to highlight the most important information in a text. First, let's look at how to add annotations to an article. Then I'll share some tips to help you focus on central idea.
Annotations are a great way to keep track of our thinking and to mark important information as we're reading. I can add an annotation over a word or sentence by clicking and dragging over the selection of text. I can then choose a highlight.
Okay, so pay attention to the way she highlights these important parts.
Interacting with the text in this way is important for active, close reading, and it helps my teacher see which parts of the text stand out to me and which I might.
Now look, this is annotation. I didn't put that as a look for on the video, but notice how she's taking the central idea and she's annotating or taking notes in the margin.
Need more support with. When we are closely reading a nonfiction text, it can be easy to focus on interesting facts and too many details. But it's important to understand what the text was mostly about and ask ourselves, what was the main idea? The central or main idea is the most important point of a paragraph or larger selection of text, which tells the.
So there's your definition. The central idea is the most important point of a text.
The reader what the text is about. Sometimes the main idea is stated in the text. Other times it's implied and requires us to analyze multiple points or pieces of information. Annotations can be a great tool to help us focus on what's most important in a text. My first tip is to use the highlight feature to.
Okay, there's that word, highlighting. So you're going to use highlighting as a tool to help you remember what's the central idea.
Mark the main idea sentence of the article. This will help us choose the most important information in the text. Let me show you what I mean with this article. Millions, billions, trillions, making sense of numbers in the news. The title of the article can be a great tool to help me identify the topic, who or what it's about. Here, millions.
So here you see, this is where we remember one of the look-fors is how does the title and the different section headings, how did they help us understand the central idea?
Billions and trillions tells me we're going to be reading about large numbers and maybe trying to understand how they are used in the news. I might preview the headings to confirm my prediction based on the title. Now, I'm going to read for more information on this topic. I know I need to highlight the main idea of the article, but I might start by asking myself what smaller sections are mostly about in order to help me make that determination.
As the teacher in this lesson goes through the next part, please make sure that you're thinking about, keep central idea in your head and keep key details in your head. The math part, well, that's for another lesson.
Let's start by reading the introduction. News stories often talk about the government spending millions, billions, or trillions of dollars. It can be hard to make sense of these big numbers and to really understand their effect in the world. It goes on to say that using my knowledge of the relationship of smaller numbers can help me learn how to handle these larger amounts. This seems to be really important. One of these sentences could definitely represent the main idea. I'm going to keep reading to help me decide which might be most important. Here it says scientists and mathematicians often understand one idea by comparing it to a simpler one. If we hear on the news that someone stole $20 trillion, but the police got back $165 million, it might be hard to understand if that's good or bad. If we simplify the math, imagine $1 million.
So what I see the author doing here, and I hope you're observing this too. She's highlighting the text that matches the central idea. She's looking at those ways that those big numbers inform our judgment.
Is equal to 1 penny. That would mean the police recovered $1.65, but that $200,000 was stolen. That helps us see there's a big difference between millions and billions. This section is talking about the world's richest people hiding money in shell companies to avoid paying taxes. This means governments across the globe are losing money. If we estimated they were losing out on $500 billion per year, and think about what that means per second, it'd be the same as losing.
I like this part because the teacher who's doing this lesson, who's helping you learn to use this tool of central idea, she talks about these papers show how some of the world's richest people hide their money in special shell companies to avoid paying taxes. Well, so why is that important? And then she goes to conclude, well, hiding that money means that governments around the world are losing this big bunch of tax money. Again, so here's the central idea, and all of these facts are the important parts that support it, that prove it.
$16,000 per second. It's easier to consider how much that really is when we make the math a little bit simpler. After carefully reading and thinking through the points of this article, I'm ready to highlight a sentence that best represents the main idea. This article is really about how it's important to understand the huge difference between millions and billions and trillions. This sentence from the introduction, it can be hard to make sense of these big numbers and to really understand their effect in the world communicates that central point. Now that I've highlighted a main idea sentence in the text,
Okay, so here's that question, the last key vocabulary, or the last look for, as before we started this video, was to be able to answer this question. So here's the question. What did the author want me to learn about this topic? Now listen to why that's important.
I want to consider, what does the author want me to learn about this topic? Answering this question just after I read will help me be more specific and explain the main idea in my own words with a complete sentence. Sometimes I might be asked to respond to this question in the right prompt, but I can also answer using my annotation. Previously, I highlighted the main idea sentence, but now I might write what the author wants me to learn about this topic in the margin. Oftentimes, we can get a sense for the article's main idea in the introduction, but it's important to keep reading to really understand what the author wants us to know about the topic. I know the text is mostly about making sense of large numbers to understand their impact. There are several examples of making the numbers easier to understand to help us recognize the huge difference between millions, billions, and trillions of dollars. It's important to note that difference because governments routinely spend and discuss such large amounts. We hear those discussions on the news, and if we understand the money being discussed, we will be better citizens who better understand the world. I think the author wants me to know there's a big difference between millions, billions, and trillions, and it's important to understand those values when we hear them discussed in the news as they relate to governmental spending or issues. I
want to stop here and ask you to notice. So, the main idea, she highlighted the sentence that really starts it, but notice, she types the main idea in her own words. She answers that question, what does the author want me to learn? She types that in her own words because she's done the reading and she wants to make sure that she answers that question for herself, just like you all. There's not going to be a one way that you type this. It has to be how you understand it.
Next steps might be to summarize the article in the right prompt, or support my response with evidence from the text.
Here are some quick reminders of what to annotate for when you're finding the central idea of a text. When we're reading an article, it's important to understand what the text was mostly about and ask ourselves, what was the main idea? To help focus on the most important information, we can use the highlighting feature to mark the main idea sentence of the article. Remember, preview the title and section headings to predict the topic, and consider what selections of the text were mostly about to help you find the main idea of the whole article. And after you finish reading, write out your answer to this question. What did the author want me to learn about this topic? This will make sure we consider the most important information in the article and formulate a complete sentence to describe the main idea. Now you're ready to try this on your own. Good luck, and thanks for learning with us today.
Okay, so let's review our look-fors. We know what the central idea is now. We know that it's the most important idea or the most important fact that the author wants you to learn from reading the article. We know that at the beginning we need to look for the title and section headings. We need to look through them before we read the whole text to get an idea of what the author is teaching us. Remember, she said a good place to start for the central idea. And by the way, central idea and main idea, we use them interchangeably. They mean the same thing. Introduction, we've got to start there. That's the first thing that we're going to read, the first part of the text that we're going to read to really hone in on the central idea. We're going to need to highlight important information, not just the central idea, but those details that support it or help us understand it. And we're going to use different colors, and finally, we're going to always go back to that question. What does the author want me to learn from this article? So let's go ahead now, and we're going to do it together. So we're moving into the guided practice. What you'll need for this lesson is you're going to need the informational text from News ELA. The article we're reading today is More Barriers to Equality in U.S. Now Than 50 Years Ago. It's a new study finds. That's the title of the article. You're going to need 3 colors of highlighters. And when we write the summary, you're going to need to think back to the RACES strategy. All right, let's get started. So I've created this timeline, or this timeline, I'm going to call it that. the steps that we go through in order to figure out the central idea of a text. Now, this is based on the video. And so if you look at this, the first thing, we're going to review the title and the headings throughout the text. Step 2, we're going to read the introduction. And I put a little sentence there. The central idea is often in the introduction. Then we're going to go back and use our first highlighter to mark the central idea. And then we're going to here's where we read the text a little more closely. And we're going to use our highlighter to mark the key details in each section. And finally, we're going to write out the answer to, what did the author want me to learn about this topic? So this is basically the video in a step-by-step process. Okay, so here's the article. Before I put it up on the screen, there's some key vocabulary that we're going to need to know and to look for as we read in order to understand it. So the terms are barrier, segregation, discrimination, impact, policies, and diverse. So as we read, we're going to be thinking about those words. Now, usually, I would pre-teach you these vocabulary words because it's an informational text. So I want you to already know them before you start reading, or at least have an idea of them. I'm going to just quickly go over barrier. If I think about barrier, it is something that I put in place maybe to make people not go somewhere. I'm thinking about Tybee Island, and now that people can't go onto the beach because of COVID-19, they've put barriers up that keep people from walking on the beach. Segregation. You probably know this word. You've heard it before in social studies when we've talked about the civil rights movement. So segregation, the splitting up of people based on something you can see. During civil rights, it was their skin color. And other times, it's what language they spoke. Or now, maybe we can think of it as people who live in a certain neighborhood and other people who live in a different neighborhood. So segregation means coming together, splitting up people according to something that you can see that is different about them. Discrimination. Again, you know this because you've studied it during the civil rights movement. Discrimination. Giving some people access to something while other people don't have access to the very same thing based on segregation, so based on something we can see about them. Impact, we'll learn about that in the article. Policies, again, that's a key vocabulary word. We'll look at it in the article. And diverse. Diverse means difference. We know the word diversity, which means if you are in a class where there are boys and girls, where there might be English speakers and Spanish speakers, it means there are lots of people who have different traits, who have different personalities, and so diverse means different. All right, so here's the article. I really like it. All right, so what do we need to do first? Let's go ahead and look at the title and look at the headings. So the title says, Study shows racial segregation, so splitting people up by their race, child poverty rising in the United States. So study shows racial segregation and child poverty. So two things are rising in the United States. Rising, getting higher, more of it. We're going to skip the introduction. All right, the first heading says poverty, racial segregation, increasing. So it goes back to that title. So we know two things are getting higher, poverty and racial segregation. The numbers are getting bigger. More people are living in poverty and more people are living in segregated neighborhoods. The next heading, systemic racism is something we don't talk about. So here's another, so I wonder, how does this systemic racism is something we don't talk about? Well, so how does that connect with the title. So if these things, racial segregation and poverty, are increasing, one of the reasons that they are increasing is because we don't talk about it, we, Americans. So it's not a topic we often talk about. If we don't talk about it, I'm thinking we must not be doing much about it. Input from a diverse set of scholars. So I'm thinking this study must have had input, people added to it, a diverse set of scholars. So these are people who know, scholars, learners, people who know a lot about this, and diverse, many different kinds. So it's not just one type of person. So I wonder how that is going to influence the poverty and racial segregation. Maybe it's going to validate it. And finally, the last section, media needs to hire more Black and Latino journalists. Well, I'm thinking if racial segregation is a problem, then one of the ways to solve that problem would be to hire more Black and Latino journalists. There would be more diversity. Okay, so we looked at those, so we kind of have an idea now. This is a problem, racial segregation and child poverty. It's a problem. So let's read the introduction to see if we can, what is a central idea? Let's see if we can find it there. What does the author really want me to learn? What's most important? So here we go. I'm going to read just the introduction, these first 3 paragraphs for you. A study made public on Tuesday, February 27th, looks at the nation 50 years after the release of the important 1968 Kerner Report. I was born in 1968. The study observes a deep inequality in the country. Child poverty is increasing in the United States, as is racial segregation. The Kerner Commission observed the same issues 50 years ago. The new report blames U.S. policymakers and elected officials. They have failed to address inequality, it says. The report also lists areas where the country has seen a lack or reversal of progress. U.S. Senator Fred Harris of Oklahoma is a co-editor of the new report and the last surviving member of the original Kerner Commission created by President Lyndon Johnson in 1967. Racial and ethnic inequality is growing worse. We're segregating our housing and schools again, he said. There are far more people who are poor now than was true 50 years ago. Inequality of income is worse. So based on that introduction, I feel like we've learned something. So the title, these things, racial segregation and child poverty are getting bigger, are rising. So that seems to be a problem. And I want to go back to the last paragraph, the 3rd paragraph of the introduction. And I think the central idea may be right here at the end. So let's reread this part. Racial and ethnic inequality is growing worse. We're resegregating our housing and schools again. There are far more people who are poor now than was true 50 years ago, and inequality of income is worse. So I think this really means something to me. What am I learning? This is new for me. I am learning that in the United States, there are far more people who are poor now than 50 years ago. I think that's a big problem because I look at society and I think, there should be less people living in poverty. So I'm going to highlight this yellow. And now, remember, we're looking for the central idea. So if I type in central idea, I'm going to leave that there. So now I have it. So as I read through the rest of, if I leave this as a central idea, now I'm going to go back and I'm going to look at each section heading, and I'm going to see, well, how does this support this? There are far more people who are poor now than 50 years ago. So let's go to the next section. Poverty and racial segregation increasing. I'm going to let you read this, these 3, 4 paragraphs. So if I start here at the topic sentence, a new study called Healing Our Divided Society, Investing in America 50 years after the Kerner report. I think that's a fact. So let's you read on in this paragraph. So I think after you've read it, I'm going to highlight this sentence. The percentage of people living in deep poverty has increased since 1975 by 16%. That definitely supports my central idea. So I'll highlight this as one of those details. If you look at the sentence, the second paragraph, the study also observes continued housing discrimination. Read on. Okay, so if there's this problem of housing discrimination, I think the problem there is that housing discrimination leads to segregated neighborhoods, which lead to segregated schools. Now, I remember from studying the civil rights movement that segregated schools were what we wanted to do away with. And yet, here they are, coming back again. Topic sentence. The result of such inequality has the largest impact on people of color and those struggling with poverty. I think this detail is really important. In fact, you know what? I might not even do that according to the report. They, people who live in these segregated neighborhoods and who live in poverty, they are confined to poor areas with inadequate housing, they attend underfunded schools, and they are viewed as suspicious by law enforcement. That seems to be important. Going back to my central idea, there are far more people who are poor now than was true 50 years ago. Okay, I'm going to go through the rest of this pretty quickly. The next heading says systemic racism is something we don't talk about. That has to be part of the problem. If we don't talk about it, we don't know about it. We don't know it's a problem. So I know I read this already. So this is important. These are the details that are important here. Systemic racism and systemic poverty refer to larger systems of power. They allow for deep and deepen racism and poverty. That's a problem. If we don't talk about it, then those things get worse. Next, input from a diverse set of scholars. So I want to say that diversity is a good thing. So if that's true, look at this first sentence. Tells us that this report includes input from diverse set of scholars, African Americans, Latinos, Native Americans, and women. I know that's an important detail because that makes me believe this report. It seems like it gives it credibility. So there's another detail. Finally, if segregation is a problem, then diversity seems to be the solution to that problem. So, right here, I think the important detail, if you have people from different backgrounds adding to the stories, you're going to get a diversity of stories. You'll hear everyone's stories, not just one story. Okay, so here I have it. So I go back. Here's the central idea. I believed this was the central idea. There are far more people who are poor now than was true 50 years ago. Inequality of income is worse. But now, after I read this article, I go back and I'm like, look at this sentence. Racial and ethnic inequality is growing worse. We're resegregating our housing and schools again. I might add this. I think this is going to be part of the central idea as well. These two sentences. I can always change my central idea with more details from the text. All right. So now what do I have to do? If I go back, I know that this is the point where I'm going to answer that question. So what did the author of this article want me to learn? What did he want me to learn? Resegregating. I think I can use that. Do I spell it right? Resegregating. All right, I'm going to start a different way. There are more poor people in the United States today. There is also more segregation So there's my central idea. That's what the author wanted me to learn. He wants me to understand that there are more poor people in the United States today. There is all more segregation in America today. I think that's important. So there we go. Here's our central idea of this passage. There are more poor people in the United States. There is also more segregation in America today. If I wanted to make that one sentence, I could say there are more poor people and more segregation. Well, I'm just going to put it in. Racial segregation in the United States today than in There we go. All right, so let's leave that there for now. And let's go back to our project. So we know the central idea now, right? We answered the question, what did the author want me to learn about the topic? I can even tell you now without looking back at the article. The author wanted me to understand that in America in the 2000s, 2018, there is more poverty and more segregation, racial segregation in the United States than there was in 1968. There, I learned it because I can tell you about it. So now our job is to write a summary. I'm not going to play this video because I want you just to remember, because you're going to get another lesson on the race strategy. So in the video, I wanted you to look for restate, cite, explain, and summarize. And you all know from being in 6th grade this year that that's the way race is the way we answer those questions that require thinking. We have to construct the response. So let's get right to it. Here's the race strategy, again, in a step-by-step way. Restate the question, what's the central idea? So that's our question for this assignment. What is the central idea? We're going to answer it. We'll cite evidence from the text, we'll explain, and then we'll summarize our central idea. So if I go back to my central idea, I'm going to start my summary that way. So here we go. the central idea. So there's my restatement, and now I'm going to answer it. Okay, I'm going to do one cite evidence as an example, and then we'll finish up at a later date. Okay, so what's my key detail? So I remember this. I'm not sure which I want to use. Let's use this one, my citing evidence. I'm going to cite this from the text, this quote. It says, so I'm going to have to tell them the Kerner report, says the percentage of people living in deep poverty has increased by 16% since 1975. So I'm going to copy that. I'm going to go back here, and I'm going to, okay. I need to replace it with the Kerner report. Oh, is that what that report is? Hold on. Oh, in the report, Healing Our Divided Society. Okay, so here's my cite. The report, Healing Our Divided Society, says the percentage of people living in deep poverty has increased since 1975 by 16%. So now I have to explain, why is that a problem? Why is the fact that more people are living in poverty, why is that a problem? Well, if you live in poverty, then you aren't able to buy, you aren't able to live in a, you have to live in, what do we say, lower quality housing. You don't have good housing. And that affects the people's lives. Can you imagine it? More people are living in poverty and in troublesome housing than back in the 1960s. So we're going to explain why this is a problem. People who live in poverty aren't able to afford I want to say good, how about safe? That's my explanation. People who live in poverty aren't able to afford safe housing, and they may not the things I want to put something about food in there, but I won't. Okay, so here we have it. We stated, we answered, we cited evidence, we explained how it works, how it's important for the central idea, and now we're going to summarize. I wonder what I should write here. I don't want to really repeat myself. I don't know if all of you have learned that you just take the first sentence and put it at the end. For me, I'm going to just kind of reword it. Oops, I think I need, in the 2000s, more people live in poverty than, I'm going to put my knowledge of social studies, than during the civil rights era. I think that's important. So there's my summary. Now, I didn't I didn't cite more than one piece of evidence. To write a summary, I would have to keep going. But I want I want to make sure you have a chance. So now, remember at the beginning when we said we're going to write a summary that was free from personal opinions and judgments. So I need to look back at, do I start any of the sentences with I think, I feel, I believe, I learned? Let's go back. No, I did not start any sentence with I. That's one of the things I always teach, is that if you have that I in your summary, that usually is an opinion. Let me go back. Did I judge any of this? Did I say that I agreed or disagreed? Did I say that living in poverty was good or bad? I didn't. I did, but it was connected to the data in the article. But I didn't say I. People who live in poverty aren't able to afford housing, safe housing. They may not be able to afford the things they need to live. So this summary is free from personal opinions and judgments. Let's conclude. In this lesson, we determined the central idea of an article. Yes, we did. We figured out what was the most important idea in the article about poverty and segregation. Did we write a summary? We did, a short one. Was our summary free from? Our summary did not include personal opinions and judgments. It didn't. So we met this standard on informational text. Thanks for listening.